Hey, everybody, I am Bishop Megan Rohr from the Sierra Pacific Synod, and today we are having our first conversation for the Bishop's Book Club. And the book we will be talking about is If God Still Breathes, Why Can't I? Black Lives Matter and Biblical Authority. And I have with us today the author of the book. Would you be willing to introduce yourself to everybody?
Thank you. Of course I will. I am so appreciative to be here. My name is Reverend Dr. Angela Nicole Parker. I am the Assistant Professor of New Testament and Greek at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia. I often describe myself as a person that education did not take the first time, second time, third time, fourth time, or even fifth time. It was later in life where I was blessed and fortunate to go back to school, do an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD after having been married at a very young age. Got married at 18 and was a teenage mother, but then subsequently got divorced and then raised children as a single parent. And so, as you can see, I'm an African American woman and I identify as womanist, and I'm trying to do the best that I can do out here in these New Testament streets as a womanist New Testament scholar.
So that's a lot of your intersections and
Yes.
some of the ways that you're embodied in the world. What are some of the ways that these intersections inform your faith?
I think it's only been after thinking about these intersections for a while that they've really informed my faith more over the past few years. Growing up as a traditional Black Baptist, and when I say traditional Black Baptist, I grew up as a young girl adult who accepted Jesus early as Lord and Savior and kind of grew up with the idea that as a woman, there are certain things I'm supposed to do and not supposed to do, that I'm supposed to get married, bear children, be a good mother, be a good wife. And it was only after going to different conferences where you are the only Black person with predominantly white Christians, and you begin to see, white folks actually worship slightly different than how I've been raised. And I think realizing and going to different churches and seeing the ways that Black Baptists operate differently than others, I began to see that my identity as a Black person was different. And then I began to think about my own identity as a woman and my calling to preach and to teach. And I think that the intersections of being a woman, a African American woman, and also someone who's kind of grown up in a lower middle class environment, not necessarily poverty, but just lower middle class, not from the upper echelons of society, now all converge in the way that I practice my faith and talk to God, which puts me in the realm of social activism and also in the realm of how I read the biblical texts. And so I think it's after years of really thinking through my intersectional identities have I begun to see how they've informed my faith more than when I was an 8-year-old girl who accepted Christ as Savior. Oh, I lost your sound.
In the book, you talk a little bit about the ways that you see the world differently, maybe than some of the white academic scholars, and some of the ways that white supremacy in religious teaching have silenced groups of people. And you don't have to share all of those secrets. I'm naming that because I want people to read the book and to participate in our discussion groups about it and to be curious to learn more about that.
Yes.
But I wonder if you would be willing, for those who haven't got the book yet, who are interested in maybe getting the book, if you could give them a little bit of a summary of what your book is about.
Sure. I, again, am so appreciative of the education that I received, and I would not change it for the world. However, what I have begun to understand throughout my education is that the ideas and the doctrines of inerrancy and infallibility regarding the biblical text lead to what I have described as white supremacist authoritarianism. And so I'm trying to walk a line in the text in my book where I'm thinking about the biblical text as an authority for my life, because the Bible, as I said, I've grown up Baptist, and the centrality of scripture is important for Baptist faith. But what I've understood through education is that there have been wielders and arbiters of power, usually white male scholars, who had the opportunity to read and interpret biblical text before my forefathers, foremothers even had an opportunity for education. So those doctrines of inerrancy and infallibility were actually wrapped up within white male biblical scholarship. And I do believe now that there are a critical mass of Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, Asian scholars who are coming up in the fields now to begin to question some of those doctrines that are wrapped up within white supremacist thought. So I'm trying to work out a little bit of my own salvation and my own understandings while still holding to the authority of the biblical text, while questioning the authoritarianism of people behind the biblical or the preaching and teaching of biblical texts.
Yeah, and it's really brilliant the way you laid it out, because it's almost like you're talking to yourself, but it's clear that you're talking to us. And so I appreciated kind of the, you don't shy away from like academic language, but you don't stay too academic so that it's not something that's like accessible for people. And one of the things that I was really appreciating about the text is that even in some of the like headlines and subsections, there's like a whole sermon just in a subsection headline, like turning crap into womenist bursts of air, right? Like
Yes, yes.
this idea that you name the thing that was problematic, you name the way that people tried to train you to be a white thinker, right?
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
you name the ways that you are seeking new ways in the world and how other people can seek new ways in the world. And I think what I'm curious about is that naming that is brave work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pushing print
Yes.
feelings that you have and the things that lived in your brain or the conversations you might have had that you didn't share with the white academic thinkers is brave work, and sometimes comes with consequences.
Yes.
um, how did you provide self-care for yourself or the wellness that was needed in order to be someone who was willing to like push print and to enter a space that critiques those who have taken so much of the space, like the care that it needs to turn the crap into breaths of fresh air?
I appreciate that question, because therapy, Jesus, coffee all need to go together. I think therapy, Jesus, coffee, self care. And when I talk about self care, I've discovered hemp seed or CBD bath products. And so that relaxation also is helpful. But the other thing is, I recognize, especially through therapeutic work, that anger also builds up inside of us. And so for me, I have to do a few things. Oftentimes, talk therapy does not help me, not completely. Body therapy helps me a lot. And I have to sometimes actually hit something. And when I say hit something, I'm talking about a boxing bag. Most of my students and colleagues know that I also have a boxing bag that's right to the left of me that you all can't see. But when I need to be angry and let the anger out, I do that. But I also recognized in the midst of gaining that practice was that it does no good for me to hold these conversations in for the sake of keeping other people happy or appeased, or keeping other people in comfortable situations. I think that what I'm trying to do and have been trying to do in the book was allow my colleagues who know me well to keep me accountable in the anger, but also in the work, the righteous work that needs to be done after coming through that anger. Not just to critique without something beautiful coming out of it. And I needed something slightly beautiful to come out of the critique, even as I take care of myself with therapy, bath, hitting something, and having good colleagues who also keep me accountable in the midst of this. So, all of that work together helped me to be able to critique while still taking care of myself and not necessarily worrying about what all the ramifications will be. Of course, I worry about the ramifications, but I also hope that good conversation comes from my critique of biblical scholarship and the ways that it has begun to, how it began in German biblical scholarship. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it does. And I also appreciate, oh, here, let me make your screen a little bit bigger. I also appreciate that for the very nerdy amongst us, if you look at the books behind you, you can also see some of the threads that, right? This isn't a brand
Yes.
new conversation. Especially the church and the lynching, the church, the
Yeah,
cross.
the cross and the lynching tree. So to
Right?
that's a James Cone picture right there. And
Yes.
so you have James Cone and Katie Geneva Cannon, folks. A student gave me those prints to have, and just folks that I very much admire and were a part of my own upbringing in the academy as well. So
Yeah,
yeah,
sometimes that's the wellness, right? The community of the saints that push
yes,
us and inspire us, and the art that kind of draws us to be able to kind of keep moving forward.
yes. Oh, I remember one conversation because it's been since 2018 that Professor James Cone has been on the other side of the ancestors. But one conversation we had before he passed was there is work that our biblical scholars need to do. And oftentimes biblical scholars, because biblical scholars tend to be still 80% white men, biblical scholars who are white men can often ignore other scholars. So if we're 80, if my academic field is still 80% white men, they can ignore the 20% of us who are not white men. And so I have to remember the conversations that I've had with the James Cone and with Katie Geneva Cannon and continue to do this work, even if it has ramifications where people may get angry. But it's worthy work.
Yeah, it's very worthy work, and I think that there are ways in which the majority white male way of having conversations about the Bible has been continued into the future, even when leadership in churches has diversified, because of this idea that there has to be neutrality or independence, or that, like, having embodied experience in something somehow makes you only notice your own liberation, and you have to prove that it really exists despite the fact that you felt it and known it.
Mm-hmm.
And to work through kind of this scientific idea that there is an independent, rational way to look at things. And what that has missed is that was just an independent, meaning a white way of looking at things, and trying to keep others out with elbows so that they couldn't have room in that space. And so you in this book, I think, join a colony, a tribe, a community, a group of ancestors who have been using terms like Black and Womanist for ways of talking about how experience matters and how embodiment matters.
Yes.
But those words have evolved over time as well.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for you, especially for those who maybe haven't read the book yet? Maybe they have never heard of womanist thinking. How would you describe that for folks so that they kind of have a taste of what kind of wisdom they get to soak in the hot tub of?
I love that question. Soaking in the hot tub of womanist wisdom. I would describe womanist thought as the ability to take seriously the experiences of Black women in these United States of America. So, womanist thought was and is a thought system that centers around what it means to be Black women sitting around the kitchen table, meaning it wasn't started in the academy, but it did come to the academy, I want to say in 1985, when the three womanist mothers, Katie Geneva Cannon, Jacqueline Goldsby Grant, and Dolores Williams, were part of the school or PhD students under James Cone, who began to see that Black liberation theology, such as the liberation theology of James Cone, did not necessarily speak to the experiences of Black women. So, because Black women were gaining ground in the academy and doing theological work, they were also in conversation with feminist scholarship to begin to identify as well how womanist is different than feminist, because feminist, when you think about feminism growing up in the era of the suffrage movement, that movement was particularly geared towards white women, specifically white middle class women. So when I introduce myself as a Black woman who comes up from a lower middle class family, and there's a difference between what lower middle class Black looks like as opposed to middle class white, I think that we have to take seriously the differences that genders experience oppression. And so womanists really take seriously that Black women experience a quadrilateral idea of oppression, mainly because of being Black and because of being women. So there's that race and that gender, but also a class issue that comes into play with how womanists began to analyze theological texts, begin to analyze biblical texts, and again, begin to ask different questions while still being connected to Black liberation movements and also being connected to feminist movements. However, I do argue that proto-womanists were beginning their work even before the women's suffrage movement. When you think of Black women preachers like Jarena Lee or Julia Foote, they were out here doing work that was freeing Black communities even before the suffrage movement comes about. So usually in my classes, I do point out proto-womanists doing the work of preaching and teaching even before the suffrage movement. So there is that idea that Black women's experience, even from colonial slavery, was vastly different than the feminist movement and even different than the Black liberation movement.
One linguistic question that someone
Mhm.
is looking for clarity on. When you say the academy, what do you mean?
When I say the academy, I'm talking about folks who are part of the Society of Biblical Literature, which is one of the oldest academic guilds in these United States of America, started in the 1800s and started with white men, of course. And then also, I'm talking about the American Academy of Religion, another old institutional guild as well, that puts forth us as scholars who go to these schools, get a PhD in Bible or a PhD in religious studies or a PhD in systematic theology or a PhD in Christian ethics, and then we go to these schools and we teach. So oftentimes what's happened is there is a split between the academy and then the church. So a lot of us, especially womanist scholars, not all of us, but a good number of us, go into the academy or go into getting a PhD because for some reason, not for some reason, I'm being facetious here, but for a lot of denominations, we were unable to be ordained because we were women, but we were able to go and get education and then become professors. So there's still oftentimes a split between the academy, as I've just identified, and the church. So I think that womanist biblical scholars, womanist theologians, womanist ethicists, we still have the desire to be both conversant in the academy that's still predominantly ruled by white men, and even in our churches, which have its own misogynistic issues and other issues of homophobia, oppressions, misogyny, that we still want to cross boundaries with both of these institutions.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I sometimes that's sometimes a great barometer for knowing which words translate and which words don't translate to lift them up. All right.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
questions of clarification are always good.
Yeah. Well, and we have a very diverse synod. It goes all the way from just below Visalia in California all the way up to the Oregon border and out across like northern Nevada. And so that's a wide variety of folk who are near academic places and folks that are very rural ag communities. And so lots of different ways of talking about God and the Bible and even just different educational accesses. And
Yes.
so it's lovely to be able to find the words that, cross all of those different regions as well.
Good.
I'm curious because we're Bible reading folk. What and I'll say too, like one of my favorite parts is that in chapter 4 you really move into like talking about the Bible and even some translations about what the faith of Christ means. Like I love because there are so many times when Paul is relegated to being anti-body and anti feelings and anti-women sometimes, that I love that you take a deep look into Paul and find some of like the liberative spaces. And so just wanted to lift up that I love that you took some time to like dwell in the scripture in here. And I'm just curious what Bible stories are speaking to you right now?
Oh, Bible stories that are speaking to me right now. I will always delve into Paul because I just love Paul as a thinker and as someone who you can almost chart his thought processes throughout his letters. So Paul will continuously be a conversation partner for me, but I'm also working with crowds in the Gospel of Matthew and the ways that crowds change and sort of move within the gospel. So you think about the crowds who began to be gathered when Jesus is preaching that first Sermon on the Mount, and to consider how the crowds in the Gospel of Matthew actually respond to the 5 different sermons that Jesus preaches in the gospel, and then to think about that last week of Jesus's life and how the crowds turn. I'm thinking about crowds and thinking about actually emotions that travel through crowds. And I think that part of even what I get to a little bit when I talk about gaslighting and shame in the book, that there's elements of the stickiness of emotions that get into crowds as well. So we just saw something on January 6th that talks to me about crowds and what crowds catch. And so I'm wondering what crowds catch in the Gospel of Matthew as well. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. And I'm still preoccupied with the woman who's in a flow of blood in Mark chapter 5. And so that woman in that flow of blood, not a hemorrhaging woman, I'm playing with that translation to talk about what it means for women to constantly be in a flow of blood, meaning a flow of deceased blood bodies that we see all around. So I'm playing with that as well.
Yeah, I love all of those spaces quite a bit. I was playing with that too and thinking of because I took some time a few years ago to try to translate the Gospel of Mark and to be really deeply thinking about the words. And the word for crowd really stuck with me because a lot of times, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, the crowds are pissed, right?
Yes, yes.
And the way that we would define that is to call it a riot, right? And
Right.
if you only define something a riot in America when it's a particular skin color of people, not based on their behavior or on their attitudes, there's a couple times in the Gospel of Mark where I think it's a riot.
It's a riot, exactly.
And what happens if every time you translate the word crowd, you call it a riot?
A riot.
Right?
Interesting.
Because so many people, like that's what they end up putting Jesus on the cross for, was saying he was inciting a riot. And so I've kind of played with this idea of looking at what the crowds were up to. Like, what if there were all these riots that were ignored until it was this one guy?
Yes.
Right? And why did we pick that guy to punish? And I think there could be a whole series on kind of if it was racial implications, right? Because it preaches to our present day to wonder why some crowds are okay when they're big and loud and passionate, and other crowds are not okay when they're big and loud and passionate. And so just kind of even thinking about that with the English word riot really spoke to me. And yeah, Mark's gospel is for me a really provocative place to do that. I've been thinking about that hemorrhaging woman too. Like, even if you just call it the menstruating woman,
right?
How does that change it? And for me, it's been a really beautiful text because there are so many narratives that say, oh, you're just supposed to suffer. You're just supposed to live with the thing because God wants you to live with it. And taking up your cross means suffering in your body. But I think that story of the woman who is bleeding is a story where Jesus says, even if you could live with it for a long time, even if you could reconcile your brain to the fact that no one can fix you, you don't have to live with your suffering, right?
Exactly.
And acts anyway. And so I love that as a counter narrative to all the places that say you need to just sit with it, and that God wants your body to be grumpy, or whatever that means, right?
And that makes no sense to me.
I hear it a lot, though. Yeah.
And I just can't fathom the thinking that says all of your issues and all of your problems will be solved in a hereafter, and you can't taste any benefit of the healing and the salvation right now. Salvation, that word, is also a word that talks about present healing in our biblical text. And we have made it all big about the hereafter, which has been very detrimental, especially to folks who were formerly enslaved, because they would tell you, you'll have your mansion after you die when you cross the Jordan. So just keep picking cotton, you'll be okay. Your body may be achy, but you'll be okay. You'll feel better in the hereafter, while others were living in the lap of luxury. That does not make any sense to me.
When you get to heaven, you can wear shoes.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah. I've been thinking about that because a lot of what bishops do is to travel a lot. And there's this, I've been listening to Tracy Chapman's New Beginnings as I've been driving, because what I love about it is that it starts with a song about how everything's broke and you can't fit, like that heaven is going to happen later. And then it ends, the CD at the end, the last song of the CD is about how heaven is right now and it's everywhere. And to be able to sing it in the same in the same kind of conversation if you listen to the CD from the beginning to the end, if you're driving an awfully long way.
Yes.
To just know that, like, you got to have both, even though both are imperfect. And
Yes.
right,
Yes.
that's kind of what we're all driving for and hoping for and striving for, if we can get there.
Yes, exactly. And to help other people along the way as we're all trying to get there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's time to
Agreed.
start all over, she said. I don't know. That we have a question that I'll lift up to you, and you can decide what you think. How does, or could your work in your book
Mhm.
influence, improve, or affect the revised common lectionary?
Well, I would definitely lift up the work of Dr. Will Gaffney regarding the lectionary, since her work, the the Woman's Lectionary for Our Time, has just been released in August. And I actually allude to her work in translation in my own book as I think about how we read translations and people have made decisions for us regarding translations that we may not have necessarily would want to make on our own. So I think that the combination of womanist scholarship, my work, the work of Dr. Will Gaffney, the work of Dr. Mitzi Smith, the work of Dr. Love Seacrest, the work of all these fabulous womanist New Testament and Hebrew Bible scholars that are coming up would definitely improve the preaching from the lectionary if others would engage the work. And I think that's the main thing. The improvement for the lectionary comes with the other sources that you read that are different eyes on the text than the eyes that we are normally used to. What does it look like to preach lectionary text with women from the underside of society, with impoverished people from the other underside of society, with those who we constantly oppress from our LGBTIQ plus communities? And what does it mean to read text with folks from the underside of society? How do we do that? And I think that would improve revised common lectionary series. But I have to say this, I'm born and raised Baptist, so I didn't even know what a lectionary was until I went to seminary.
Yeah, I preached at a couple churches in West Oakland, and they the way they would say it is, like, when I'd be talking about whatever the lectionary text said, and then I would go to end the sermon, they'd be like, "You ain't done yet." And they usually weren't wrong. Like, they were like, "There's more to say, and just say the things that need to be said, and we'll
Yes.
listen until you're done." But it seems like there's more to say. And
Yes, there's
so,
more to say.
right,
Yes.
honoring the places where the Holy Spirit shows up and
Yes.
operates outside of that 12 minutes that some people only have the patience for, or whatever their
Oh
particular
my
time frame
goodness.
is. Yeah, right.
Usually a 20-minute preacher, so I guess I need to calm down some.
Yeah, now, I mean, Bethlehem Lutheran, they trained it out of me. So now I just preach till I'm done, and I just apologize later if it was too.
Good.
What are they going to do, right?
Exactly.
Well, we have a number of people who are hoping to do the best they can, better than they used to do it. Is that
Yes.
the way to say it? And um, but also don't want to tread into spaces where they ought not to tread,
Yes.
or speak for groups that maybe they can't speak for.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, what what are some examples of things that maybe white people should refrain from doing if they want to support Black and womanist faith leaders and scholars?
Yes, that's another great question. I often think about even my own friends who I've gained over the years who had to begin to get a sense of what can I say, what can't I say? And the main thing I think for faithful white Christians, faithful white parishioners, is to not delegitimize the experiences of Black and Brown and other folks. One thing that I've heard, even since the writing of this book, and I relay some instances from my own seminary experience, some people would say, well, I don't remember that. That couldn't have possibly happened. And I would say, but you're already delegitimizing my experience because that was not your experience. And instead of delegitimization of someone's experience, actually take the time to listen and try to begin to understand another viewpoint. And the interesting thing, especially about the context of the United States of America, is that we have become known for wanting people to assimilate. And so when I think about even getting whiteness out of my system, whiteness out of my body, I have to think about how, in some instances, I want to assimilate in order to almost pass in some spaces, but you can't do that. You have to just kind of figure out how to be okay with other people having a different experience than what you experience. And so the main thing for me is not delegitimizing someone else's experience. But also, I think that idea of actually walking along with other people and entering the narrative stories of folks, of other folks, and actually having empathy with other people, near or far. And it's been interesting to me to hear conversations in other denominations of empathy being a sin. And I don't know if you all have heard these conversations lately, but I think that some folks are beginning to think about empathy as sin because they think it brings other people into someone else's sin if you have empathy with them. And I'm just trying to figure out where we all went wrong, where we can't even begin to feel for other people. I think that's the thing.
Yeah, I think there was a period maybe in faithful conversations where we tried to figure out if like the language of Al-Anon or the language of
Mhm.
addiction recovery was something that we needed to do when it came to sin or where we noticed it in the world.
Right.
And then tough love became a thing
Mm.
that kind of came into the culture. And then I think somehow there became this long conversation about what is love and what is loving. And for some people, the definition of loving became being tough or being truth telling, or when is it truth telling and when is it erasing someone, right?
Exactly.
and
Yes.
and when if it takes you 15 minutes to describe it, is it no longer love anymore? Like if you got to
Mhm.
convince the other person that that's what it is. And so
Right.
there's something about how those conversations happen that really made it hard to know what's doing the right thing and what's not doing the right thing. And I think I liked the way you described it, is like that the idea that being empathetic
Yes.
is somehow not acting faithfully.
Right.
Hmm.
I have a hard time reading the New Testament text where Jesus is talking to someone and they ask a question and Jesus is not almost feeling that person. What would it look like if we actually were people who felt other people
Hmm.
like Jesus would? That would be a better society,
Yeah.
a better transformed society.
Yeah. Well, and I like the flexibility of the Greek word splunknitzomai,
Yes.
like that
Mm-hmm.
feeling, like it's actually like a twisting of the bowels, and maybe it
Mm-hmm.
means
Mm-hmm.
crying. Jesus wept.
Yes.
Maybe it
Yes.
meant Jesus was disgusted and vomited. Maybe it means, right?
Yes.
We don't know what it was, but it feels like it happens in moments where Jesus does deep listening and then maybe loves the people. But it's like, what is it that happens?
What is that? But
right?
but imagine it's bodily too.
Yeah.
It's not intellectual.
Yeah.
It's not, let me think about it and let me give you that 15-minute response. It's actually within your body. And so I think part of my entire work wants to be, how do we do these things that actually pay attention to what's going on in our bodies and not just head and abstract thinking and upper level questions that don't actually get into your body. That's the thing. And I think we miss it because we're reading text on a paper that we've been trained to read silently in a corner by ourselves. But that's not how the early Jesus followers would have read it or heard it. A lot of them would have been illiterate. So someone would have come in, they would have been at a dinner, and they would start just reading the text and acting it out and being energetic, not, oh, let me read this quietly in a corner by myself. That's not what would have happened. So the whole idea of what feeling in our body means has to take root for us in congregations today. That's what I hope and pray for too.
So what I'm hearing from you is that we want to take the word into our bodies.
Yes.
And feel it and experience it and digest it and recycle it and keep staying engaged in it. But we want to, like, I think the language you said was getting the whiteness out of your body.
Yes.
Can you talk more about what it means for you to get the whiteness out of your body?
Yeah, that's a hard one too, because I think we swim in whiteness without necessarily realizing that we swim in whiteness. And I often talk about experiences that I've had in order to begin to think about getting whiteness out of my body. I can easily call someone on the telephone, they don't know who I am, and I can put on the perfect, hello, this is Dr. Angela Parker. Can I please speak to, and sound like the perfect, I don't know, white woman somehow. But other times I will split a verb, I'll use slang, I'll use inappropriate language, and you'll hear my own ethnic identity come out. But for me, it's that slippage that I can often go back and forth in. And we talk about code switching, especially in Black community. So I can code switch and actually put on the persona of what certain white audiences may expect of me and do that quickly and easily without batting an eye. And I think just that it's not whiteness per se, but it's a white construct that allows you to try to pass in and out of situations. And I think that I've become a little bit more comfortable in myself and actually being maybe not always saying the right word or not acting like I have to know everything. And it's interesting because I've been in classrooms where I've co-taught with people, and it's usually the white male professor who has to know exactly every answer all the time. And I've actually stood in front of classrooms and said, "No, I don't know. It could be this, could be that." And I'm okay with not knowing because I don't have to have that persona of I know everything and I have every right answer for everything. And that's the interesting thing about Christianity, too, because we often think that we are operating in certainty. And from all my reading of text, we're not really operating in certainty, we're operating in faith. So that's another element, I think, of whiteness that actually gets into Christianity, that Christians are supposed to operate in this certainty that's also almost equivalent to whiteness. And what does it look like to not operate in that certainty? People freak out. So I'm still working on those things for me, but I think that's where I'm beginning to at least try to exercise some of those demons.
Yeah, I think what you did is you named something that I was appreciative for in your book, and that's um, that it is presented as ideas you have right now, not as these are the right answers. And it's not presented as here's the formula of what you, if you learn these things and you regurgitate them, then you will have right knowledge. Like that it is set up to say, here's some stuff I'm thinking about. Here's some questions I'll leave you with in case you want to think about it too. And it's not about solving something or even saying your perspective relates to even anyone other than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about, I think, inspiring conversation and trying to open people up. And so I think it lends itself to being a great book for folk to read kind of in groups and to have follow-up discussions with, because you put the questions right in there that people can talk about next, right?
Good. Yes, that's what I was exactly trying to do. But I also think that one aspect of whiteness that's been interesting for me to witness is the okay, we've gotten to the right answer, we've solved the problem, now let's move on. And when you think about the history of these United States of America, I don't think we've solved a lot of problems and we haven't been able to move on. I think we've just ignored them and acted like we've solved some problems. And I think that lends to the idea that by the time you finish a book, you should have solved all the problems. No, that's a framework that I don't think is a part of who my own cultural identity is. That there's always a movement to keep going through. There's always work to be done. There's always marches to attend, because as soon as you finish one problem here, another problem's going to pop up and we need the forces again. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect of whiteness that I'm beginning to try to disavow myself out of as well.
Well, I very much appreciate it, because as people who work in churches, or as people who interact and kind of dwell in those spaces between the academy and the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a bishop, I'm both trying to help with the communal discernment of which leaders should be lifted up and who has studied and what kinds of studies they should have in order to be ordained and certified and credentialed,
Mm-hmm.
and try to encourage congregations to collaborate and live out mission and be active in the world. And hopefully we're all pointing at Jesus as we're doing this work, and
Yes.
talking about God and centering that. But sometimes, like, emergent stuff comes up in the middle, and you got to prioritize and figure out how you're going to do it. And so I just so appreciate that you have been lifting up words like gaslighting, and lifting up words about that are kind of like tangible ways for people to untangle themselves from some of the ways that
Yes.
whiteness might have stuck to them, or they might have been told that that's what they need to do. And I'm excited. I'm excited for the folk in our synod to kind of encounter your book, and I'm excited because I hope that it inspires, the next place where you're pondering things to come out in something like this that people can engage in. And there are very few people who are trying to honor the, like, intricacy of the ways academic words are very long and try to be very specific,
Mm-hmm.
and also, like, be readable
Yes.
and accessible and something people can talk about in church spaces. So I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate the work that you've already done, the bravery of pressing print, um, and the loveliness of allowing us to take a peek inside of part of your brain and some of the stuff that you're thinking about. And I'm so excited to keep following your work. If those of you who don't know, I first encountered the Reverend Doctor on Twitter, because I wanted to diversify the voices I was listening to, and I don't know how it happened, but that our feeds intersected, but I'm grateful that they did.
I'm so very grateful. Thank you.
How do you think it would be okay for people to connect with you if they would like to learn more from you or connect with you online? What are the ways that reaching out to you is appropriate?
All right. Thank you for that question as well. You can always reach out to me through Twitter. My handle is ANP22, F as in Frank, A as in Apple, B as in boy. So ANP22Fab on Twitter. You can also reach out to me through my Facebook page and also at Parker_AN at Mercer.edu, since I am a professor of the New Testament at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology. And for those who are ever interested in getting a seminary degree, I always urge people to check out McAfee. But the other thing is, I will have a website that I'm still putting together. So if you follow me on Twitter and then want to know what my website will be, that website will be uploaded on my Twitter profile as well. It's not active yet, but it is about to be active. Everything's happened so quickly, and I did not realize that some of the intricacies that come out of my brain would garner all these conversations, but I feel very blessed and fortunate to be in conversation with folks who read If God Still Breathes, Why Can't I? Black Lives Matter and Biblical Authority.
Well, know that we'll be praying for you,
Thank
and
you.
we'll keep studying your book, and I just again wanted to thank you for all of the work you've already put out into the world and for the ways that you've taken time tonight to chat with us.
Well, I've appreciated it. Thank you all so much for the conversation.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Take
Go buy
care.
your book.